Afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to see you, and may I start by thanking Nancy. You have guided us through the first day and a half masterfully, but now you're taking a well-deserved break, and I hope I can live up to your very high standards in chairing this important session. So welcome to the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Annual Conference, Business Unusual. A rapidly changing world calls for adapting peacebuilding in Africa. And our session now is entitled Assessing the State of Citizen-State Relations and Peacebuilding in Africa. My name is Terrence McNamee, and I am proudly a Global Fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars Africa program. On behalf of the Wilson Center and Carnegie Corporation of New York, thank you for joining us in person and online for this session this afternoon. For those of you, again, who are unfamiliar with the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, or SVNP, it is a network of 22 African policy and research organizations that work with the Wilson Center Africa program to bring African analysis and perspectives to key issues in U.S.-Africa relations. Funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York since 2011, the project provides avenues for African researchers to engage with, inform, and exchange perspectives with U.S. and international policymakers in order to develop the most appropriate, cohesive, and inclusive policy frameworks for the issues of peace building and state building in Africa today, including our topic. Now again, our topic could hardly be more important: assessing the state of citizen-state relations in Africa and its impact on peace building. I'll abuse the chair a little bit and take a few minutes to frame this really important discussion, which I know is going to provoke a lot of debate, because we talked about this yesterday. A terrible jet lag. I was going for an early morning run on the mall this morning. And I thought, looking around at the memorials and the monument, I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could take this session outside and go on to the mall? Because there's no area that really evokes the importance of citizen-state relations like this place just a few hundred meters from us. And I think that it's such a potent, salutary reminder that we have to nurture this relationship between citizen-state, because if ignored, we do so at our peril. And within the African context, because Africa's borders and its citizenry of states were decided not in Africa, but in faraway capitals, this is all the more essential. Because we all know that, generally speaking, the post-colonial African state, like its colonial forebear, was more a source in people's minds of fear than it was of safety and security. And the legacy of that lives on today. We talked about democracy yesterday, and it's important. And encouragingly, as we're going to hear from Edem, in terms of Afrobarometer's important work, the trend lines are very encouraging. Africans desire democracy and want more and more of it. But the reality is, for most Africans, democracy is experienced as a single event that happens every 4 or 5 years, an election. Because in between these elections, the touch of democracy in Africans' lives, its experience of democracy, is very, very light. And in fact, for many, it's almost imperceptible. And because democracy is not experienced by most Africans as a real part of their everyday lives, it causes alienation from the state, it causes marginalization, it causes disempowerment, and these are all the breeding grounds for chaos and instability. In the country that I've spent the last 12 years, South Africa, we are seeing this on the streets today. A hardening and a widening of the of a belief amongst citizens that the state does not act or does not serve their interests. Now, of course, a lot of this can be blamed on the ruling party, but it's not just the ruling party's fault. It's business, it's civil society. In fact, it's everyone's fault. Everyone dropped the ball, because in 1994, at the birth of multi-party democracy, I think my experience is that many South Africans felt that that's it, that we're just going to see a strengthening of democracy, a strengthening of the social contract. It's just going to evolve organically. And people stopped working. And that's a real problem, because nowhere near enough was done in the area of political and civic education, teaching, educating people about rights and responsibilities. And it didn't evolve organically. And we see now that we've lost these, great reference point for the country's better angels, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu. And it's incredibly sad, because once they're gone, into this vacuum, a lot of not so great things happen. And we're seeing that today, into this void of faltering citizen-state relations. We are seeing rabid populists. We are seeing ethnic mobilizers. We are seeing political nihilists. And that's a real, real challenge. So I hope today in this panel, we're going to speak very frankly about the state of citizen-state relations, and hopefully some ideas about how we can strengthen a colonial inheritance that saddled African states with very poor citizen-state relations to begin with. And unfortunately, for a lot of states, there hasn't been much progress on that front since. So just a reminder for housekeeping is that we are live tweeting today's event and asking questions online. To join the discussion, you can follow along on our Twitter account at Africa Up Close using the hashtag #PeacebuildingAfrica. To ask a question, you may tweet us or use the chat box function on the event webpage. So we have three absolutely amazing speakers today who are going to provide a lot of value add in terms of what they know and speak to their strengths on this subject. And our first speaker, Dr. Eden Salome, did I pronounce that correct? No. No, okay. I apologize. You're going to correct me when you start speaking, but she has a very, very illustrious bio. She's the Director of Research at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. And I think critically, and I won't read the whole bio, but critically for our purposes, she was also Director of Capacity Building for the Afrobarometer Network. And if anyone has done research on democracy in Africa, you realize what an indispensable tool Afrobarometer has been for all of us. So on that note, let me turn it over to you. And just a reminder, we have 8 minutes, and I'll try and stick to that religiously. I'll hold up my phone if I think you're going too long, as fully in the
survey, and many of the things that I'll say today were mentioned in that session. But let me begin first by addressing the question of what the current state of citizen-state relations is in Africa. I will start that with what I think is resulting in the strained relations of citizens and states in Africa. But first, citizen-state relations and interactions between the states and institutions and societal groups is how to negotiate public authority, how public authority is exercised, and how it can be influenced by people. Citizen-state relations also focus on issues such as defining the mutual rights and obligations of the state and society, negotiating how public resources should be allocated, and establishing different modes of representation, accountability, and citizen-state relations are the reciprocal relations of rights, responsibilities and obligations between states and citizens, and which is underpinned by a social contract. So why do I think that citizen-state relations in Africa is strained? First, we are beginning to see low levels of trust in institutions in Africa. And again, I'm going to refer to the Afrobarometer survey data, where we are seeing that the trust in political institutions and political leaders is declining. Only 4 in 10 Africans say they trust their presidents. Again, we see the same low numbers trusting their parliaments, and parliaments are the direct representatives of people. We also see the same low numbers of 4 in 10 saying they trust their local representatives, their local authority. Again, if democracy is supposed to be participatory, it starts at the local level. And here we are, citizens do not trust their local councils. And yet instead we are seeing that a comparatively higher trust ratings in community leaders, such as religious leaders who are not voted into office, who are not elected. We also see that traditional leaders are also trusted more than the presidents or the parliaments that are elected into office. The other reason why we are seeing low levels, a strained relationship between the state and citizens, is what we had in the previous session, which is a constitutional coup d'etats. Again, Afrobarometer survey data shows us that Africans are emphatic about their preference for constitutional term limits. Our findings in 2021 show that 7 in 10 Africans want to see constitutional term limits to their presidents, to presidential term limits in office, 2 term limits to presidential terms in office. Yet we are seeing that constitutions are being tampered in in many countries, especially Cote d'Ivoire, where Alassane Ouattara tampered with the constitution to extend his stay in office. We also saw that in Guinea and Togo, that these countries have found ways of using institutions of democracy to undermine constitutions to extend their stay in office. These constitutional amendments, which are usually opposed by citizens, usually occur through fraud, intimidation, and without citizen consultations. And in many instances, citizens are not allowed, do not even know that the constitutions are being tampered with. The result of which is a violation of fundamental human rights, such as the right to vote. Freedom of expression and assembly and access to information is sometimes curtailed in many of these countries. In cases where citizens challenge these practices, we see that the state responds by unleashing security forces to silence any dissent any dissent. We saw this in the lead up to Uganda's election of 2021. Where President Museveni, for instance, stated that over 54 people were killed by the police and the military, and this happened during the protest after the arrest of a leading opposition presidential candidate and popular musician Bobby Wine. Now, we also see that some governments have also used the judiciary to persuade and prosecute dissenting voices, with victims being imprisoned under trumped-up charges. All of these, of course, have created a situation of animosity between the state and citizens. Now, the next is what I call, or what we see as, democracy capture. Now, democracy capture occurs when a few individuals or a section of the supposedly democratic polity are able to systematically appropriate to themselves the institutions and processes as well as dividends of democratic governance. They distort democratic politics in such a way that it systematically favors an elite and grants them privileges over a majority of the population. even where there is a facade of popular support and legitimacy. Democracy capture also enables the elite to maintain a stronghold over state institutions and resources and dominate society from that position. It therefore endangers a vicious cycle of the ever-weakening democratic institutions, poor quality governance, and social economic backwardness. Democracy capture also prevents a creation of a political culture that sustains democratic principles, institutions, and processes, and thereby accelerates the decline of democratic institutions and further strengthens the capture of democracy. So whilst many constitutions across the continent provide for the separation of powers, this has not translated into practice. Some practices in several African countries reveal that the capture of the legislature and judiciary by the executive results in the loss of parliamentary oversight and judicial independence. In Tunisia, Guinea-Bissau, and Senegal, parliaments have been dissolved after MPs voted to roll back power grab, leading to violent protests and citizens demanding accountable governance. Well, finally, still on the question on the strained relations between the state and citizens, we see that citizen-state conflicts have been exacerbated by economic meltdown in countries such as my own, Ghana and Malawi and Nigeria. And this further widens the gap between citizens and the political elites. In most instances, this has been attributed to corruption. And by far, Afrobarometer surveys have shown that the level of corruption in many African countries has been on the has been on the rise. Many of our countries that we surveyed have seen a significant increase from the perceptions of how they perceived corruption a year ago up until when we conducted the previous surveys. We also see that in most cases, citizens' demands for accountability of public funds and resources are met with hostility by the state and further deteriorating the state of the citizen-state relations. So I'll now move on to the positive trends for citizen-state relations. And for me, that is what we see as a preference for elections as a means of choosing leaders versus a one-man rule. In any democracy, elections play a critical role by actively linking citizens to the state. Elections, in principle, give the average citizen a voice in governance and serve as a means for which the public can hold the elected to account. Again, the Afrobarometer surveys confirm that 7 in 5 Africans prefer to choose their leaders through regular, open, honest elections than other methods of choosing their leaders. We also see that large majorities reject alternative forms of government, such as the authoritarian regimes, presidential dictatorships, and military rule. Again, these numbers are in the high sevens, so more than 7 in 5. Essentially, what we see is that the majority of Africans choose democracy as a preferred type of political regime over any kind of government. Whereas, about 14%, and now, when in the last session we were talking about, civil society or civilians rejoicing over coup d'etats in places like Mali, I would say that is the 14.8% who feel that other forms of governance other than democracy are the ones who rejoice when that happens in their countries. Again, we see that although many of Africans have become disenchanted with the way democracy works, they still believe that the power of the polling booth is the only way they can make their voices heard. Now to the negative trends.
We can get on to that.
Right. All right. So I'll just pick on one of the negative trends, and then we'll move on to other issues, or I move on to COVID.
30 seconds.
All right. All right, so how have global developments such as COVID interfered with citizen-state relations? And I would just focus on COVID for now. The pandemic did not only show the state of the health, expose the nature of health service delivery in Africa. It also led to some of the things that we'll see in authoritarian regimes, like clamping down on the fundamental rights of freedom of expression, association and public gatherings, including protests, were prohibited. And most of all, civil society organizations, such as the one I work for, who play a critical role in creating checks and balances on the exercise of power by governments, were considered non-essential services and were asked and forced to remain closed for prolonged periods of time while citizens suffered violations of their human rights without recourse to justice. Again, as I said, the pandemic exposed the shortfalls in the healthcare delivery in Africa. Again, our Afrobarometer surveys have shown that, the healthcare delivery system in Africa is one of the least, developed. Many citizens have gone without the healthcare service delivery in the past year, and if they've had to go for healthcare, some would have to pay a bribe to get healthcare. And juxtapose that with the COVID period. If in ordinary times they were already paying a bribe to get healthcare service, how much more during the COVID period? Now,
Sorry, we've got to. I don't make the rules. I'm so sorry. I don't. And
It's
remember,
so unfair.
there's no democracy when it's the panels. Remember, it's authoritarian. I'm so sorry. I don't make the rules.
All right.
But we've got to move on.
So, well, I would just close with what recommendations, and I think I just speak on a demographic that I think it's the largest these days in Africa. At least they say they're the 77% of the population, which is young people. To reconnect citizens back to the state, and I think young people have to be empowered. Young people have to be involved. Young people have to feel connected to the systems or institutions or or what we call democracy. Right? I mean, young people these days feel like a peripheral to what democracy really is. They have an understanding of what their needs are. They have an understanding of what they expect the state to provide them. And I think that we have to bring them back in.
Okay, thank you so much. Democracy capture is one thing that stuck out from me. Let's move on right away. Matthew, let me get your bio up. Dr. Matthew Cloutier, an economist in the Francophone West Africa unit of the World Bank's Governance Global Practice Unit. His operational and lending supervision work includes decentralization, service delivery, and public finance management projects, with a special focus on the Sahel and fragile countries such as Mali and Niger. So much more in his bio, incredibly illustrious career so far. Matthew, if you can, 8 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. And I wanted to start by thanking the Wilson Center and the organizers of the event for giving me the chance to come talk to you a bit quickly about our work that we've been doing using the social contract lens in our engagement at the World Bank. I also want to say that it's a bit the fault of the organizers why we tend to go beyond, because they gave me four guiding questions, and on each of them I could have talked for hours. And so I blame them a little bit. I just want to start by kind of differentiating something. A lot of people, when they hear social contract, the first thing they think about is Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, and natural laws. And I think this classical theory and this classical approach was very in the vogue in the 17th century, but and it really addressed this kind of idea that people are born with natural rights, but then they have to set apart some of these rights to live in a society, to have a ruler, provide some services such as security. So it really is about in the 17th century this creation and this legitimacy and this origin of the state. Now, we move on 400 years, and in the 21st and 20th century, there's been a rediscovery of the social contract as a lens, but it's much more focused on some functions of the state, right? We take the state as a given. It exists. It is most of the time a good thing, not all the time. And we're going to try to optimize some of its arrangements and some of its institutions to achieve some goals, such as social justice, inclusive growth, but also peace building, which is what brings us today. Peacebuilding application from the OECD in 2009 is where we really took our defining kind of basis for what we do with the way we approach social contracts. So the definition we use is social contracts are this dynamic set of agreements between citizens and state on their mutual roles and responsibilities. That's it. It's a quite simple definition, but we think it encompasses three of the main critical aspects of it. First of it, there's this agreement, the agreement process. Then there's the outcomes, the policy and the development outcomes that are generated by this relationship. And then finally, there's the resiliency or the dynamicity of that agreement. So for the agreement process, we are talking about what is the nature of the bargain, but also what are the bargaining space, what is the bargaining capabilities. And on this aspect, we really work from kind of the work that we're doing on political economy, but also from the WDR, the World Development Report 2017 on governance and the law. The second aspect, policy and development outcomes, this is really the substance of the contract. You know, what does it provide to citizens? And most importantly, how do citizens perceive it? Because as we're going to see in the next few minutes, we think that perceptions is very what matters. Perceptions and expectations are where key is. And I think there, my colleague here has addressed some of this. And then finally, the stability of the system, the resiliency of it. Is there a possibility for a renegotiation of the agreements? Is there an openness to the renegotiation? How do the feedback loops and the mutually reinforcing cycles in it work and either lead to a worsening of the relationship or an improvement of it? Now, these are three really basic aspects that we see key, but there's a lot of things that I haven't mentioned. And we think these things are also important, but I don't have time to cover them here, and I'm happy to address a lot of them in the question period. But including in that is the colonial legacy, of course, very important, elites and political settlement, democracy and elections, legitimacy and trust, but also the different levels of government, because we don't see it as there is a one social contract. There's a national one, there's a local one, there's a community social contract. Every governed space, in a way, has a social contract. Now, this definition and this framework is really centered on the citizen-state relationship, but it's also, the way we see it is it frames it. It defines the roles and the responsibilities. It defines the ways that the relation is bargained and is renegotiated. But it also describes how the relation coalesces into development and policies and outcomes. One of this outcome is, of course, peace building and conflict. And the way we see it connected to the social contract is through this misalignment between citizens' perceptions of what they're getting from the social contract and their expectations or their aspirations. When there is a misalignment or when the state does not provide what is expected or even goes against it in certain situations, it leads to unrest. And now this unrest can be responded to in different ways, can be responded through openness and renegotiation or through repression. And we see that factor into two main trends in Africa that have been discussed a lot. The first one is protest and demonstration. Zakaria Mempili and Ms. Lisa Muller, Dr. Lisa Muller, have talked about a third wave of protests in Africa. And how it has been increasing over the past 15 years. We've seen, I think they include in that the Arab Spring, but also I think 2019 was seen as many as the year of protests that led to a lot of governments being toppled and regimes being toppled. Now, some of the times this protest and these demonstrations are peaceful, and some of them become violent. And I think for us, we see the closing of the civic space as one of these drivers that turns a peaceful protest into a violent protest. And that turns into our second big trend that we see for Africa, and that's been described a lot by the Uppsala conflict data program. And they've recently published a report that describes kind of the nature of conflict in Africa and actually in the world. And we see that in the 50s and 60s, still up to 50%, sometimes 60% of the conflicts are still interstate or extra-state. But more and more, and today about maybe 95% of conflicts are actually intrastate, which means they're between citizens and their state. Sometimes, and a new trend, a new type of conflict that has appeared is the internationalized intrastate, which means groups that mobilize citizens in different countries. We're thinking about like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and turns them into against their state. Now, to turn a citizen against its state, of course, there's this misalignment, but there's also this idea that there's a feedback cycle between violence that begets violence. The Journey to Extremism report published by the UNDP describes this process of mobilization and recruitment of citizens against their state, and they say that in 71% of the interviewed ex-combatants that they've talked to, government action was the final trigger that motivated the combatant to finally turn in and join into an armed group. So it's very important. Sorry. Now, in multilateral and international institutions like the World Bank, I think intuitively people really grasp the importance of the social contract in their work, in development, and in peace building. But it also kind of creates some issues. So one of this is that it's very difficult to work meaningfully with the concept of social contract. And for that, I want to give an example from my own experience. Since I've started working with it, I've worked with countless number of teams across the world, from Brazil, Morocco, but to Somalia, Sudan, Haiti, and every single team comes to our team with the same issue. They all come to us and they say, we know what the problem is. The social contract is broken. And that comes from you, from the team in Brazil, comes from you, from a team in Somalia and in Sudan, but how can the social contract be broken in all of these places? Like, you still have citizens that are paying their taxes, you still have citizens that, in some of these countries, respect most of the laws, the state provides some services. So clearly, just to maybe misquote Tolstoy on that, but I mean, all social constructs are dysfunctional, but they're all dysfunctional in their own specific way. And to talk meaningfully about the social contract is to be able to have the language and the terminology to describe in different ways how it is dysfunctional and how you can work with that. Because the second issue that we have when working with social contract is that all of these different teams also then commute to you with the same issue, the same solution. They say, well, we know what the solution is. We can fix the social contract. My project, my program, my strategy will fix the social contract because it's broken. But the social contract is a societal, it's a generational, it's enormous phenomenon that is in society. And no project, no program can really hope to have a meaningful or substantial impact on the social contract. But there are ways where the social contract approach can help these countries and these projects to achieve the actual objective that they want to do, whether it is in education or in transport or wherever. So perfect, because I'm going to just close with 3 recommendations that we have for our partners and our colleagues. First is, social contract approach can be useful. It can be useful to build contextual awareness, to understand the capabilities of citizens and of state. But to do that, to have this contextual awareness, we need better data. We need data that goes beyond state-provided data, and that goes beyond expert-generated data that comes from people who sometimes only spend an afternoon or a week in a country. And that's where the Afrobarometer is extremely useful, and other sources that use data that comes directly to you from citizens, from the people who actually matter. But we also need to have a better dialogue with local stakeholders and a two-sided dialogue. My second recommendation is that the social contract approach can help institutions to balance their programs, because a lot of the institutions that we work with, they have a tendency of being very state-centered. very supply driven, very, we're going to fix the state and then the state will do what we expect it to do to its citizens. And it completely neglects the other side of that medal, which is citizens. The citizens need to have capabilities to demand, to have voice, to hold the state accountable to their promises and to their projects. But to do so, they also need support. It's not only the state that needs support. And so therefore, institutions need to be able to deal on both of that and finding that right balance. Finally, I think we need to go beyond a lot of the work that some institutions have been doing that are really focused on transparency, accountability, participation, the TAP trifecta, because a lot of these initiatives are very supply-driven. We build a system and we hope that citizens will use it. We will, transmit the data about the public enterprises, and we hope that citizens are going to use it. But in a country without a free press or freedom of expression, or necessarily the channels on the other side of the lane that can turn this data, this transparency into mobilization, into citizen engagement, into change, we need to also deal with the bottom up, which means go where citizens are currently working, where the citizens are currently holding their meetings, which is not necessarily in forums organized by the state. And these locally grown and from the ground up forums, they can also be supported. CSOs, civil society organizations that represent citizens the way citizens want to be represented, can benefit from support and partnerships with big institutions. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Yeah, I must confess to being guilty of using that term social contract too liberally. So thank you very much for reminding me that we need to be a bit more precise with our definition. So let me finally turn to Mzwandile Ndlovu, say a little bit about him. Again, another very distinguished CV, which I won't read in full. But he's a research and policy analyst working with the African Institute for Development Policy. He currently works on the Africa Integrity Indicators Project as Anglophone Africa Project Manager. Now, I don't know very much about that program, so I'm fascinated to hear more about it. But it says here it focuses on African governance, examining how policies are implemented to support state, citizens, and civil society in assessing key socioeconomic and political mechanisms across the continent. Over to you, Dr. Ndlovu.
Thank you very much, Terence, and also thanks to the center for giving me this opportunity. By the way, that was an excellent pronunciation of my name, Terence. I'm going to be...
You win some, you lose some.
So throughout my presentation, I'm going to be making a frequent reference to the Africa Integrity Indicators that Terence said he knows little about, that we run as the African Institute for Development Policy. And so to answer the first sub-question of my presentation, that is assessing the state of citizen-state relations in Africa, from our indicators, I isolated a small group of 14 countries that arguably have the most significant security issues. The 14 countries being Libya, Sudan, South Sudan, Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, the Central African Republic, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Niger, Mali, and Chad. And so I'm sure we all realize that these are countries that are either experiencing different intensities of civil war or that have gone through different kinds of coup d'etats. And so I also selected just 5 of our indicators from which we can glean something from the relationship between citizens and the state from these particular countries. So among the indicators that I chose, there is indicator 65 that is looking at the freedom that labor and trade unions have to organize in the countries. There is one that is also looking at citizen freedoms of association. The other is looking at government censorship and restriction of citizen online content. The fourth one is looking at mechanisms that are there for citizens to report police misconduct or the abuse of force. And the last one is looking at citizen access to financial records associated with natural resource exploitation, particularly with regards to gas, to oil, as well as to mining. So as not to waste too much time, one thing that is coming out strongly from the participation or from how these countries have performed across these 5 indicators is that on each of the 5 indicators, at least 70% of them have performed poorly on those. So at least 70% of them were scoring as little as a score of 0 or a score of 25 in as far as those indicators are concerned. And so in brief, what the indicators are telling us about the relationship between citizens and the state is that the states are restricting the freedom of labor unions to operate in the countries. They are clamping down on citizen freedoms of association and expression. There is heavy government censorship and restriction of what citizens are putting in the online space. There are no mechanisms whatsoever for citizens to report misconduct or abuse of force by security apparatus. And lastly, the states are withholding crucial information from the citizens about what is happening, particularly the exploitation of natural resources. And also I can speak briefly outside those 14, among the best performing countries cumulatively, some of the countries that have performed very well are also facing very serious problems. Earlier, Terence Ederoti has spoken about some of the problems that South Africa is facing. South Africa consistently scores among the top 5 performers in our indicators. But, be that as it may, we saw very serious problems, particularly in 2021, when the country slid into a very, dicey situation of social unrest, characterized by, looting and rioting. And for some 2 weeks or so, the security apparatus were not able to bring the situation under control. And we are seeing, similar things in this particular year. We're seeing a specter of lawlessness and vigilantism, particularly on xenophobic matters. And also the law enforcement agencies are showing that they have very little capacity to bring the situation under control. And what I am seeing is that it shows that there is a serious disconnect between citizen sentiment as well as the state in a country that has been viewed for so long as an exceptional country in as far as its performance with democracy is concerned. So now coming to the second question, looking at how global developments have impacted on the relationship between citizens and the state, particularly COVID-19 as well as the war in Ukraine and Russia. Our indicators show us that states performed very well when it comes to, measuring how they performed on their health campaigns, informing citizens about the pandemic. So on this one, we could say that there was, some form of good performance. But on the flip side, what also happened is that states actively exploited the COVID-19 situation to stifle freedom of expression and as well as freedom of assembly, as well as media freedoms. I was contracted for a short period sometime last year by Article 19 on a project that was monitoring the COVID-19 responses of the governments of South Africa and Zimbabwe. And what came out strongly really was that in Zimbabwe in particular, COVID-19 regulations were really weaponized to try and block as much as possible citizen freedoms to assemble, for expression. We saw journalists being jailed for very long periods because of the stories that they'd reported on, of how there was a lot of corruption, particularly in the procurement of PPE materials for COVID-19. And, predictably, the courts could not convict these journalists because really the charges were rather flimsy. And so the states took advantage of these emergency regulations. So in most countries, they were the type of legislation that were of a state of emergency kind. And really they were accompanied by brutality by state security agents, the abuse of journalists. And also another thing that came out very strongly because of the emergency legislation is that the media became rather timid. They became afraid of reporting freely. We saw a trend of self-censorship in the media, which obviously affected citizens in as far as having access to information is concerned. And so things like the conflict in Russia and Ukraine have obviously taken away attention from some of the conflict hotspots on the continent. In countries like Cameroon, for example, there's always been a serious problem where they are not receiving the kind of regional and continental attention that they deserve. And now when such things happen, obviously attention is going to the global kind of conflicts such as Ukraine and Russia, as well as that's also where development funding is going. And now starting to wrap up, looking at some of the policy support that stakeholders can make to strengthen citizen-state relations, as well as peace building in Africa. My feeling is that think tanks such as the ones that many of us work for here need to utilize their research output to craft early warning systems that can be used to anticipate and prevent the festering of conflict. If such things had been done in countries like Cameroon, for example, some of the problems could have been anticipated before they became a full-blown out civil war in 2016. So the states themselves also need to be very receptive of the research output that is being made by institutions like AFIDEP, like Afrobarometer, and use it to try and prevent conflict. Civil society also needs to modify its adversarial and confrontational attitude towards the state and try to adopt a softer stance as it is increasingly and demonstratively proving to be more effective. And civil society also needs to help states with more holistic approaches that are needed to address the socio-economic challenges of countries that are facing civil war and different kinds of conflicts. Mozambique is a very good one example. And coming to the key recommendations, my smoking gun recommendation really would be that states really need to restore this social contract that everyone on the panel has been talking about and try to reinvigorate the kind of platforms that bring key stakeholders such as the state, such as business, such as labor, to always be having a regular interface so that the state is always able to pick up certain things. States also need to sharpen their national intelligence capabilities. A good case in point would be South Africa, where the chaos really erupted, and the president said that national intelligence did not even manage to anticipate what was happening. And also, violent extremism must be addressed at country, regional, and continental levels. And more vigor really should be put into implementing the existing mechanisms. It could be the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, the 2019 Khartoum Peace Accord, what the AU is trying to do through Obasanjo in Ethiopia. And the last one, states also need to collaborate on regional military interventions, particularly to try and mitigate and prevent the spillover effects of conflict. Some of these things are already a risk. Regarding what is happening in Mozambique, there's a risk that the terrorist threat could spill over into Tanzania and other parts of East Africa. And also, when we're looking at the Sahel region, there is also the serious risk that what is happening in Burkina Faso might be spilling over also into countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and Togo. And lastly, countries also really need to try and collaborate as much as possible on regional platforms, and rather than taking the bilateral route as happened in Mozambique, where SADC was actually struggling to piece together a regional force, where President Filipe Nyusi actually preferred a more bilateral engagement that brought in the Rwandan forces to help them with the conflict. Thank you very much, Terence, for abusing the platform.
Thanks, Dr. Ndlovu. I love the sound of the smoking gun recommendation. I think that's what we should title all of them. Can I remind our online audience that we are live tweeting today's event and taking questions online. To join the discussion, you can follow along, again, on our Twitter account at Africa Up Close using hashtag #PeacebuildingAfrica. To ask a question, you may tweet us or use the chat box function on the event webpage. So we have about 35 minutes, lots of time for juicy discussions. There was a lot of provocative comments and observations and insights. So let's turn it over to you. I'll take 3 questions to begin with, and I've got 3 over here. I'll stick with them. There's one there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. My name is Shotola Olusegun. I'm from Initiative for Public Policy Analysis, Nigeria. My question goes to Dr. Cloutier. Yeah, you actually recognize the fact that the social contract is broken, and that there's a need, there's an intervention to actually address that. But it's quite most of the intervention from the multilateral agencies are actually from the state. They're intervening on the state part. So isn't that why is it that if you recognize that there's a need to intervene on the two sides, then but quite a number of the funding that you do, quite a number of the interventions and programs are usually on government side. We can cite the example of Ghana. The IMF is trying to intervene in the economic crisis, but and there are resistance from the citizen, but the government and IMF is they're kind of going on. So I would like to hear your view.
Good, excellent. Direct challenge to you there, Matthew. But I'll take 2 more before we get it. Who is over here?
Thank you very much. My name is Helen Kezienwoha, and I work with the Women's International Peace Center. I'm also coming to you, Dr. Cloutier, on social contracts. You talked about the fact that there is need to maintain the citizen-state relationship. There's the assumption that the power dynamics between citizens and the state is equal. And does your own definition consider the unequal power relationship among citizens, but also unequal gender power relationship, within the context of this citizen-state relationship? Secondly, in conflict and fragile settings, does social contracts exist?
Okay, you took 2 bites of the cherry very quickly. I fell asleep there for a second here, but you got me, so you took 2 there. Augustino, not for Matthew. You're prohibited from asking a question to Matthew. So.
Thank you very much. Dazzling presentations from the panel. I my work in South Sudan focuses partly on human capital development, and the social contract element comes up in trying to navigate how you improve on human capital in the context such as South Sudan. And I wonder if there should be a recommendation or a discussion around the importance of human capital, because rights and obligations are also underpinned by the capacity of who is advancing those. And in a place like South Sudan, the president can pick up public money, donates it to the church, and the public comes out and thanks the president for doing that. That, to me, the product of inability to understand the obligation and, I guess, the roles of the citizenry. So human capital development, where does that fit in the whole thing, in the whole social contract development?
Thanks, Augustino. Matthew, you want to start us off? And then we'll human capital with one of your colleagues.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Those are all very excellent questions. I think I wouldn't see the question on whether, the idea that a lot of the multilateral interventions are state-driven as a challenge, because that is definitely something that we recognize. In the end, the state is the IMF and the World Bank's client. It is also beyond that. It is also the representative of the people. Whether that is always more or less the case is up to debate. But the World Bank itself needs to have, in a way, permission. It cannot go in countries and do things that are not allowed by the government, because they are the holder of this legitimacy. Now, those are the constraints that we work with, and are, in a lot of the times, valid constraints. This is also the way things should be. Now, when we talk more about specific projects or specific thematic, not trying to fix a national social contract, but in a sector or about an issue, whether it is human capital or education, this is where the World Bank has more leeway through some of their existing projects that are allowed by the state to interact with stakeholders, with local stakeholders, to go where the citizens are and work with citizens on these specific issues that are part of the social contract, and then become an entry point to have broader discussion about accountability. So that would be my answer to that. On the question about whether the social contract approach assumes an equality of power between groups and between no. I mean, whenever we talk about power, it is in most cases unequal and unfairly distributed about the population. Now, some of it is kind of in a way validated by local social contracts. That doesn't mean that there's not a way of having a discussion about it, that there's not also a way for multilateral and organizations to have a different kind of contracts between their clients and say, well, we think that women gender equality is something that we want to value. We're going to propose it in our engagements and see where that can be. But no, I think when we start studying social contracts, this question of where is power, where is voice, is very important, because groups that don't have power and often are the ones we're trying to help, and are also often the ones that are the hardest to work with. Because you might build a school in a very excluded community, but after the school is built, there's nothing really that says that the government is going to place a teacher there or is going to repair the school when it breaks. So that's why you need to address both, right? Both the lack of power and the inequality in the distribution of power as much as you can. I will stop there and leave a chance.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Anyone want to take up the human capital question?
Well, what I can briefly say is that human capital development really ought to be an important part of the social contract. And these are things also that need to be given practical expression even in the constitutions of the countries. And like I said during the presentation, that also there is a need for the reinvigoration of platforms that bring together stakeholders such as the state, labor, and business. And these are some of the platforms really where such things, such commitments can be made. Things like, minimum wage, things like perhaps subsidies for education, which really put, human capital development at the center of the social contract.
Thanks very much. Should I move on to the next? Let's go for three questions from here. Got the right there. Perfect.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Isike from the University of Pretoria. I just wanted to, Salome talked about, loss of trust, by citizens on the state. And then Zwandile also mentioned that there was a need to build that trust, build confidence. I just wanted to ask either of them to talk about specific, suggestions on how to build that trust between citizens and states.
Chukwemeka Eze, OneUp. I think the other issue I wanted the panelists to look at, especially Eden, is the trust deficit that also exists between the citizens, the African citizens, and their intergovernmental organizations. The danger in that is that whether African Union or the economic community, the regional economic communities are no longer seen as credible mediators in times of conflict, because the citizens themselves feel that they are not always on their side, or they're always on the side of maybe ruling party or the government.
Okay, thanks, Dr.
Okay, thanks so much. So my question goes to Matthew on sub-national governments. I'm just curious if it's possible to leverage better sub-national contracts. I'm talking about contracts between maybe federal, county, or municipal government. At that level, you can take advantage of that or use it as a launchpad to improve the situation at a national level. Is that, in your research, have you found any such route to improving the social contracts in countries?
Okay, great. I think let's start with it. Do you want to tackle in terms of Afrobarometer on the trust deficit?
Yes, I mean, building back trust between citizens and states, I wouldn't take just the magic wand to, get it back. It's something that's happened over time. Like I said, trust in presidents, trust in parliaments, trust in, local government, and even trust in, although I said that there's a bit of trust in traditional authority, that's not so high. Now, let's talk about elections. If citizens do not trust the process, how do we begin to make them trust the process? If citizens say there's corruption at the presidency, for instance, what will make that go away? Is it prosecutions? If citizens do not begin to see that public officials are being prosecuted for being corrupt, they will not trust even the courts. The Afrobarometer survey says, that majority of Africans think that the rich and powerful get away, without, when they go unpunished, when they commit crimes, for instance. How can we change that? Ordinary citizens do not feel that they are part of the process, that the state is not responsible for them. It's going to take a whole lot. And that is why when I was making my recommendations, I didn't get a chance to make to talk about all of them, but I said that, young people matter in this case a whole lot. If that change has to happen, it has to happen with them having a certain orientation about, what future they are inheriting. They have to have a certain orientation about who's leading them. Now, if you look across Africa, most of the leaders, even those who get elected into parliament, are, way a lot older than, one can, mention. I think somebody said that in the last session, that these are printable ages. So, I think that there's a lot that would have to do as civil society organizations. First of all, our work is really cut out for us. As governance promoting organizations, those of us who listen to citizens and put their voices out there through the surveys that we collect, it's definitely important. That is the only way some of the changes that we expect, can happen if citizen voices get to the ears of those who matter.
Right. Like Adam, I also feel that elections are a very important part of the answer, because this is an important tool that the citizens have at their disposal, and it really starts, with the electoral choices of the citizens, of electing public officials that really have the capacity to deliver. And also, really, the ability of the citizens to demand free and fair elections, and also to use elections as a means of punishing poor performance. And really, that is one thing that the citizens can use to procure that kind of commitment from public office holders, to say that the caliber of the representatives that they've elected are those that will be able really to follow the law, that will be able to ensure that the rule of law comes to fruition. So I think it really starts from the elections that the citizens can use.
Okay, thanks. Matthew, do you want to, social contract came up again, but is there anything you wanted to address on that?
No, I'm happy to.
Okay, thanks. Question coming in from online.
Wait, so I think there's a question on social contract and decentralization and subnational governments.
Oh, yes.
Can I?
Yeah, no, that's what I was saying.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
that's
I
what I was
thought you
asking.
wanted me to comment on the previous
No.
question.
Yeah.
I think it's an excellent question, and I'm actually going to use it to answer one of your questions that I forgot to ask, to answer on fragile states and whether there is a social contract there. I think, I'm at Chicago. I was a student of Chris Blattman, who studied a lot these conflict areas and everything. And one of the first reading he gave us was about the creation of the mafia in Sicily, and how it came about because of failures of the state, and how the mafia, in a way, started taking some of the state functions and exacting taxes in exchange for that. And I think we see that in a lot of fragile countries, where sometimes warlords, sometimes groups, they start raising taxes, they start providing services, often of justice, I think, is one of the main ones that sometimes even citizens go to these groups before they go to government, because it's more efficient. Sometimes they find it fair as well. But so there exists one. I think the only places where there are some citizens that do not go into the social contract, there's a way of removing yourself from the state. Like James C. Scott wrote a lot about on the art of not being governed, and how to remove yourself from the state, and how to because states are not always a good thing for some people. And that brings me to subnational governments. I think this is a big debate at the World Bank. I think there's a whole section of the World Bank that is devoted to decentralization, with this idea, the kind of driving idea that when governments are closer to citizens, they are more responsive to them. So municipal governments that, the mayor is neighbor to a lot of its constituents, therefore is probably more attuned to their needs and more able to answer them. Now, there is a counter-argument to that, in the idea that because they're also closer, they're more easily captured by interests that are there. For example, the richer person in the village can finance the mayor, so there is, more risk of capture, but also more accountability. So it is a debate. It is I'm a proponent of decentralization. That is my own side of it, and I've worked on it as well. And I think, but it also brings other discussions about, it's not a social contract that is in the void, right? It depends a lot of the times on the social contract at the national level, because a lot of these municipal levels cannot raise taxes. They cannot bring the resources necessary to fulfill their competences. And so it depends on transfer of resources from the national state. And that, it's not a self-standing or standalone social contract. So that brings a lot of complexity. But it is my opinion that, in a country where it's hard for citizens to pay their municipal taxes, it is hard to have a consistent and coherent national state. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Just the first question that's coming in from online, how do we duplicate or replicate the TRC in South Africa or Gachacha in Rwanda and other countries to create a culture of peace? Now, it's not an uncontroversial question because I think there's a lot of debate one could have about the TRC in South Africa in terms of that process of truth-telling and certainly unfinished business, I think people would describe it as. And then the traditional system in Rwanda, which, again, not uncontroversial, certainly probably at a minimum stopped the renewal of large-scale violence, but there's other aspects to it that are kind of controversial. Does anyone have any comments about that in terms of those two particular kind of modes of justice and reconciliation in the context of the citizen state? Does anyone have any view on that? Try to corral it back into the subject of citizen state, but I want to give our online question some airing. Anyone? I won't force it. I won't force it. But I think it's obviously important. Oh, do you want to take a shot at the question from? Please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Peter Mugume from the Center for Conflict Management of the University of Rwanda, from Rwanda. So I will mainly comment on the Gachacha courts. Thank you very much, panel members, for very interesting discussion. So, I mean, looking at this state-citizen relationship, again, it is both positive and negative, as you said. For example, from the context of Rwanda, the state being a predator to its people or turning against its people, I mean, the Rwandan government in 1994, genocide against the Tutsi, genocide led by the state to commit genocide. In that case, citizens are not trusting the state, the machine. You can see that's a negative part. But coming to post-genocide Rwanda's context, to do with the justice system, the government in place, or the state, by then decided to consult different actors, mainly from the local people, the civil society organizations, including people from the region, religious or faith-based organizations, and discuss their problems, the causes of the issues, and came up with a solution. For example, the justice system, where the people, in terms of citizens, and then the genocide victims, and the suspects or perpetrators became both judges and witnesses to address the issues of the genocide, of justice-related issues. So, and after this, the results or the outcome of the Gachacha system speak for themselves, because in terms of unity and reconciliation, we can see really a very positive trend, because the genocide perpetrators and the victims now can live together. That is a testimony that, I mean, the state-citizen relationship can be transformed into positively to build peace.
Okay,
from a justice front, for example, where through the participation which Matthew mentioned.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's my question. I'm Gachacha from Africa Institute of Governance and Development of Ethiopian Civil Service University. My first question goes to Nadulu. I think you raised a very important issue that in strengthening state society, citizen-state relations, states should allow regional military intervention as recommendation. You know, when we take the IGAD as example in the Horn of Africa, particularly in relation to South Sudan, there was controversy to, you know, states were not able to give attention to the interest of South Sudan rather than their own national interest. And the same if you go to West Africa, like ECOWAS. So to what extent this recommendation is really visible, that you put as regional military interference? My second question is to Edom. I think you talk about this traditional elders. One issue come to my mind, that's legal pluralism. Especially if you see the African, who are obviously many traditional people are very known with tribalism and so on. To what extent they are really legitimate to traditional local institutions than the state? Legitimacy is divided sometimes to the local institution than that of the modern state system. How are we going to reconcile that? I thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much. We'll take those two now.
With regards to the first one on original military interventions, firstly, I wouldn't be as pessimistic as you are about how ECOWAS may have performed, for example, on that front. I think that ECOWAS did, rise to the occasion, particularly when there were problems in the Gambia, where former President Yahya Jammeh was, trying to disregard the will of the people at the polls and trying to stay put. So I think that was a good example of how, ECOWAS really even really started assembling, some kind of force really to start really even, lining up on the border to make it very clear that they were very serious about, making, a kind of intervention. So how I think that this is practical is also because of the difficulties of raising, a force to deal with, serious conflict situations in a country. In most of the countries, really, Mozambique, for example, that I gave, an example about, it is obvious that, the Nyusi administration did not have, the capability to try and, neutralize, the terrorist threat. But there is something that, SADC could do, as a bloc, that actually eventually happened, that different countries were able to, put in troops into a regional force, some from Zimbabwe, some from Botswana, to try and assist, the Rwandese forces. So for that practical reason, there are very few countries in Africa that are able to solve on their own, security challenges. And when countries are really coming together to make, contributions to some kind of standby force at regional level, it actually does make a difference.
Traditional authority and where that converges with the modern system. What I'm going to say is going to sound slightly controversial. First, let me say we have to move with the grain of African societies. Now, what that means is that traditional authority, we had local authorities before we have a modern day democracy. How did these, traditional authorities, how did they operate? They had judiciary, they had council that listened, they had ways of punishing those who offended the traditional authority. They had ways of accounting to their citizens, although these people were blue-blooded people, they were not elected. Well, currently we have, elected constitutional monarchies, like Lesotho, for instance, which is different from what we have in Eswatini. But, I think that, there's something intrinsically, relevant to our needs as Africans. And some of that can be found within our old cultural settings and our old traditional modes. It doesn't mean that we go for something completely different, something we call I don't want to say what Izzy said, but what it means is that we have to look within ourselves, what worked for us in the past, which is what I call working with the grain of our society. There are things that worked for us that can still work for us. I think the question about what is failing us in Africa is a question about leadership, more rather than the institutions. The institutions are there. They have to be strengthened. They have to be developed in a way that works for us. We have to find the right leaders who can, provide our citizens what they actually need. I think I ended there.
8 more minutes. Sorry, excuse me, 7 more minutes before I turn it over to the panelists.
One question
very
and one
crisp.
comment. My name is Voyam Jimba. Having listened to this from the HSRC, having listened to this, I would like to ask Mzwandile, you were talking about all these things of the social contract and everybody, and all of us are talking like it's an event, but for me it's a process. What do you see as the process? And I'll borrow from economic development, knowing what the late Sanjay Lal said there are not only many heavens, but there are also many roads to heaven. Or there are not only many roads to heaven, but there are also many heavens. So our peace and democracy can be different. Let's accept that. And what was my second point? My second point, I wanted to support what you are talking, what you are saying. What's the lady? Yes, I want to support what you're saying. I think we need to. We are saying business unusual, and I keep going back to it. We cannot try the same thing that has failed. You said it's the leadership. Is it not because of the way we are choosing leadership that we have borrowed something that is foreign to us, and we are saying we're going to elect and vote and do what have you, but we had a way of selecting leaderships that is there. So we're going to the grain of the African issues that you're talking about. It's far-fetched, but remember, it is not an event, it's a process. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, very, very quickly, guys, so we can get super quick.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the Foreign Service. I'd like to go back to Afrobarometer and what Dr. Salome said. With some, it was nice to hear that Africans overwhelmingly prefer democracy to other forms of government. But I think that can't be looked at in a vacuum. While people are making that judgment or value call, they also have to think about, for example, would they sacrifice democracy for greater stability? Might they sacrifice democracy for greater economic security for them and their family, for economic well-being, for accountability? So it's not simply a democracy or non-democracy, it's how does democracy fit into all the other factors that affect the society's well-being. I'm wondering if Afrobarometer, in its multitude of surveys, has ever been able to get a fix on how high the value of democracy is held compared to other things like security, stability, and the other things.
Okay. Very quickly, everyone, because we got 2 more over here, and that'll be it. So very quickly.
I think thank you very much for the presenters. Sure. I think my challenge to you, both 3 of you in the panel, would be to question whether or not we understand the biological composition of an African as a subject, so that we can begin relating to how that subject is now relating to elements such as the state, especially if that state is translocated and pasted in an ecology that it sounds lost. That would be a critical question.
Okay, thanks. And these 2, super quick, and then we'll wrap it up. Logical composition of the Africa.
Thank you very much. I wanted to commend the work well done by the panelists, and actually to talk more about the Gachacha justice, which they talked about, and I thought it relates more with what Edem talked about, the traditional justice or traditional way of solving conflicts, because this was a traditional way of solving conflicts in Rwanda in the olden days, and where people would just come and sit and solve their own issues. So immediately after the war, when there was a lot of, number of genocide perpetrators, the courts were full, the prisons were full. So the government trusted the citizens to actually solve their own, this problem, and it worked. It worked hard because even then the government did not have enough resources to actually do the number of courts, to solve all the issues that were on ground. So justice was left in the hands of trusted citizens, and this one really worked. And I believe that a number of African countries could actually copy and look at what Gachacha citizens did. Gachacha in Rwanda how it's really being handled and probably apply to their own situations. And then I had a question for him previously on the security operators. He mentioned that sometimes security operators are not being able to, are not able to bring down situations under control. And I looked at what happened in South Africa, and I really was interested that security can fail to bring the situation under control. So is it that there's always a disconnect between security and the government, or there's a connection sometimes between, behind that? Government probably works with the citizens to bring the anarchy on the ground.
Okay.
This is what I was thinking.
Last question.
Thank you to the panelists. I am Lortal from IPAR Think Tank, Senegal. I have a quick question, and I will go all the way around, not be so context and localized. You were talking about a decrease in trust and confidence of the citizen for state or political systems, but this trend is not specific to Africa. This is a global trend, and one of the drivers that is believed to fuel this trend is misinformation, fake news. What do you think about this fake news, misinformation trend in the world? Is it happening in Africa? Is it an important challenge that we need to discuss or reflect on? And if so, what are the possible recommendations or adapted recommendations for Africans? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very quickly, we might not get to all of these questions, but maybe if you could address this way one of them, and I'd also at the same time like to offer you an opportunity to give your final 30 seconds on what you have taken away from this session.
Okay. Really trying to be brief with Vuyo's question of restoring, the social contract. I will emphasize, like I did, that a practical way of doing that is really reinvigorating platforms that bring together, social partners in the state, labor, the state, business, to continuously dialogue, on the direction of nations. And also, simple things like upholding, the rule of law, and also punishing, corruption, making sure that those that have really been found, at odds with being upright are actually, released from positions of public office. And coming to the issue of leadership selection, I also believe that we really need to start thinking about how we can, select leaders, in a manner that we are really aspiring to a higher standard, really, rather than just the current situation where the occupiers of public office are those who have really mastered the art of, manipulating public sentiment and getting people to cast votes for them. And quickly on the issue of security apparatus, I think that there was genuinely a problem of state capacity regarding, the security sector. And some of the things that the president really tried to do, by bringing in, the Department of Security into the presidency was one of the ways of trying to address the problem. I think for the past couple of years, really, there had been a systematic weakening of the security apparatus, starting from the previous administration, where some of the best people were actually not chosen to be at the helm of that important arm of the state. And to close, just in 30 seconds, what I'm taking mostly from the dialogue is that there is, an aspiration towards, upholding and restoring the social contract, though what we are continuously searching for is the nuts and bolts of really how do we repair, how do we restore, how do we uphold the social contract. Thank you, Terence.
Thank you very much. I think I will also address maybe a few questions in one final remarks. So about the composition logic of Africa and even the social contract process, I don't think that we understand it, that well. I think that's where it's important to keep trying to understand and all the localized context of it as well, because it's all different from all of the different regions. But what to me matters the most in these roads to heavens is citizens' expectations, is what people aspire to, and that's what should matter in the end. That's what should be the goal, and not necessarily goals that are transported from other places and just assume that that's also what people want to, and then achieve and try to work towards that. I also wanted to say a few words of support regarding the bureaucracy and then the mix between traditional and, for lack of better term, modern ways of authority in certain villages. I think the word modern in this way can be a bit of a misnomer. They're both modern because they both exist in the current world, and sometimes it's a distinction that can be unproductive. I prefer to use the word Weberian versus traditional, even though traditional is not a great word for that. But there are a lot of places where it works well, and every case is different. And I just want to use the example that I know of, that I'm aware of, is from Mali and Niger, where a lot of the traditional leaders are, in a way, elected. It's not universal suffrage, and they are also elected for life, but there's also a process by which they can be removed if people are discontent. It does not work perfectly, but it is also not a complete void of accountability. And that's something that is recognized, even though some of these traditional organizations are a leftover from a French system and wasn't there necessarily before. It has now been adopted, and it works in certain ways and in certain ways. So that's something that should not be completely dismissed. I just wanted to say that. Finally, on reconciliation in the peace process, I think this also feeds into one aspect of trust that we haven't talked about, and that's citizen-to-citizen trust. And that's a very important ingredient in civil capacity. It's a very important ingredient in citizens being able to come together and express their needs and express their wants. And it's also something that we use the Afrobarometer a lot to try to infer what are the bottlenecks there in social cohesion, social capital, and that's also very important. So thank you very much. I wanted to close there, and thank you to my co-panelists as well.
Thanks, Matthew.
Okay, so I will just address the question from about whether democracy has featured in the top priorities for Africans. Two responses. First, when we ask citizens whether they prefer an accountable government over an efficient one, they choose an accountable government. And then when we ask them what their top priorities are for government to address, it's always unemployment, infrastructure, health. Democracy is always at the bottom. But this tells us a whole lot, that the belly must be full first before you walk to the poll to vote. Yeah, so that's how I close.
Thank you so much. The belly's full, the roads to heaven. As Agostino said, a really dazzling presentation. Please put your hands together and thank our panelists. Our next session, final session for the day, is on women and African peace and security agenda. That'll be in about 25, 30 minutes. So thank all of you for your sterling questions and participations. Thanks.